October 2022, Willow Creek, Seattle, Washington. The Harringtons and the Valencias were the kind of neighbors everyone envied. Their homes, perched along the tree-lined streets of Willow Creek, reflected the charm and prestige of their picture-perfect lives. Ethan Harrington, a software engineer at a cutting-edge Seattle tech firm, exuded calm precision. He was known for his knack for brewing craft beer in his spare time. His wife, Emily, a dedicated pediatric nurse, was the neighborhood's go-to for organizing charity drives and potluck dinners. Together, they embodied the quiet stability that others aspired to emulate. 2 houses down lived Carlos and Sofia Valencia, a striking couple who had quickly become the darlings of Willow Creek. Carlos, a charismatic restaurateur, was the owner of Casa Valencia, a thriving hotspot downtown known for its innovative fusion of Mexican cuisine. Sofia, with her effortless grace and radiant smile, taught yoga at the local studio, drawing admiration wherever she went. The couple had an air of vibrant energy, their passionate love story seemingly lifted from the pages of a romance novel. To the outside world, these 2 families were the cornerstones of the community. They hosted barbecues, attended each other's holiday dinners, and vacationed together along the serene shores of the Pacific Northwest. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, fine fissures that no one, not even their closest friends, could see. For Emily, life with Ethan had grown predictable, even stagnant. Their conversations rarely ventured beyond work schedules and utility bills, and the intimacy they once shared felt like a distant memory. She found herself glancing at Carlos during their weekend get-togethers, drawn to his effortless charm and the way he seemed to adore Sofia. It wasn't that she wanted more from him, at least, not consciously, but the comparisons were hard to ignore. Ethan, on the other hand, found solace in his routines. Brewing beer was his escape, a ritual where precision and patience rewarded him with something tangible. Yet even he couldn't deny the growing distance between him and Emily. His focus on work often left her feeling unseen, but he dismissed it as a temporary phase. Their life, he thought, was solid, stable, safe. Meanwhile, Sofia felt increasingly trapped in a marriage that, while passionate on the surface, was beginning to show signs of strain. Carlos, ever the perfectionist, had grown more controlling in recent months, questioning her schedule and subtly discouraging her from attending social events without him. She missed the days when their relationship was spontaneous and carefree. The longer she stayed, the more she longed for something undefined but tantalizingly out of reach. Carlos, too, felt the weight of his insecurities. Though his restaurant thrived, his past as an undocumented immigrant cast a long shadow. He had fought hard to build a life for himself and Sofia, but the fear of losing it all gnawed at him, feeding a simmering possessiveness that he struggled to suppress. It was during one of their many weekend gatherings that the cracks began to deepen. The Valencias and Harringtons sat around the Harringtons' backyard fire pit, the embers glowing softly against the cool October air. Conversation flowed easily at first, discussions about holiday plans and the latest neighborhood gossip, until Carlos, with a mischievous grin, made a comment that hung in the air like smoke. "You know," he teased, raising his glass, "maybe we should swap partners for a weekend. Spice things up, huh?" The others laughed, albeit nervously, dismissing it as one of Carlos's playful quips. But as the evening wore on, and the wine flowed more freely, the joke began to take root. What if? For the first time in years, Emily felt a flicker of excitement, not about the idea itself, but about the possibilities it represented. And she wasn't alone. Though none of them dared to voice it yet, a quiet restlessness had been stirred, setting the stage for decisions they could never undo. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of renewal, a time when the residents of Willow Creek basked in the beauty of their suburban paradise. On the surface, life for the Harringtons and the Valencias seemed picturesque. Yet, beneath the golden leaves and perfectly maintained facades, tension simmered. It was during a casual dinner at the Harringtons' home that the seed of an idea, a dangerous, reckless idea, was planted. It began innocuously. The four sat in the Harringtons' open-plan dining room, illuminated by the warm glow of a chandelier. The table was laden with Emily's meticulously prepared dishes, each garnished to perfection. Carlos, as usual, dominated the conversation, his booming laughter filling the room. Sophia, radiant and poised, leaned into her husband's charisma, but her occasional glances toward Ethan hinted at something unspoken. Emily, always the gracious host, poured wine generously, her smile never faltering as she exchanged pleasantries with Sophia. As the evening wore on, and the wine bottles emptied, the conversation turned playful. Carlos, ever the joker, made a casual quip about the predictability of married life. "Sometimes, I think marriage could use a little spicing up," he said with a mischievous grin. The room erupted into laughter, but the humor masked an undercurrent of truth. The laughter ebbed into silence, and in that brief moment, the unspoken struggles in their marriages became palpable. "You know," Carlos continued, emboldened by the wine, "some people try the wildest things to rekindle their spark. I heard about a couple who," he trailed off, his grin widening. "Wife swapping," he finished, laughing again. Emily's hand froze mid-pour, and a peculiar expression flickered across her face. "Oh, Carlos," she said, her tone light but her eyes sharp. "That's quite the suggestion." She laughed, but the sound was strained, as if she were suppressing something more profound. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his grip tightening around his glass. Sophia raised an eyebrow but said nothing, her lips curving into a faint smile that revealed neither shock nor disapproval. The conversation moved on, but the idea lingered like a shadow in the room. The next day, Emily couldn't shake Carlos's words. They echoed in her mind as she went about her day, tending to her patients and coordinating the neighborhood watch schedule. The notion was absurd, even scandalous. But beneath her initial dismissal was a spark of curiosity. Could something so unconventional breathe life into her stagnant marriage? Could it reignite the intimacy she and Ethan had lost? That evening, as Emily prepared dinner, she broached the subject with Ethan. Her voice was casual, almost offhand. "You know, Carlos made an interesting joke last night," she said, slicing vegetables with meticulous precision. Ethan looked up from his phone, his expression wary. "Interesting how?" he asked, though he already suspected where this was going. Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "He mentioned wife swapping," she said, keeping her tone neutral. "It got me thinking. Maybe there's something to the idea. Just as an experiment." Ethan froze, the fork halfway to his mouth. "Emily," he began, his voice tight, "that's crazy." "Yes, I know," Emily interrupted, forcing a laugh. "But think about it. We've been married for years. Things have gotten routine. What if this could help us rediscover each other?" Ethan's initial reaction was one of shock and rejection. "You're serious about this?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "You want to bring other people into our marriage to fix it?" Emily set down her knife, her gaze steady. "I just want us to try something different. Something bold. We've lost our connection, Ethan. This could be a way to find it again." Ethan couldn't respond. The idea was so foreign, so utterly at odds with the structured, predictable life they had built. Yet, as the conversation continued, Emily's determination began to chip away at his resistance. Meanwhile, at the Valencia household, Sophia was folding laundry when Carlos casually brought up the topic. "You know, Emily seemed intrigued by what I said last night," he began, testing the waters. Sophia arched an eyebrow, her movements deliberate. "And what exactly did you say?" Carlos chuckled nervously. "The wife-swapping joke. I think it struck a chord." Sophia set down the shirt in her hands, her gaze piercing. "Are you seriously entertaining this idea?" Carlos raised his hands defensively. No, It's just. I thought it was interesting. And maybe, if they suggested it, we could. Sophia cut him off with a sharp laugh. Oh, Carlos. You're afraid they'll suggest it first, and you won't be able to say no. Her tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it. Carlos hesitated. I'm just saying, maybe it's worth considering. It's not like it would mean anything. Sophia's smile faded, replaced by a contemplative look. For all her outward confidence, the truth was that her marriage to Carlos had become stifling. His control over her life, his need to monitor her every move, it was suffocating. Maybe this was her chance to reclaim some autonomy, even if only for a moment. In the days that followed, the idea began to take root. Emily orchestrated a dinner with the Valencias to broach the subject more formally. Over a meticulously prepared meal, she brought it up, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. We're all adults here, she began, carefully meeting everyone's gaze. Maybe there's something to this idea. A way to explore and grow. The silence that followed was deafening. Carlos cleared his throat, his jovial demeanor replaced by thoughtful consideration. Ethan stared at his plate, avoiding eye contact. It was Sophia who broke the tension, her dark eyes gleaming. It's just physical, right? She said, her voice calm but charged with an undertone of challenge. No feelings involved. The conversation that ensued was a delicate dance. Boundaries were discussed, fears voiced, and possibilities explored. Ethan remained hesitant, but Emily's resolve, and Sophia's surprising enthusiasm, began to sway him. Carlos, though reluctant, eventually agreed, his motivations a tangled mix of curiosity and possessiveness. By the end of the evening, an agreement was reached. They would try it, once. Boundaries would be respected, and honesty would be paramount. As they raised their glasses to seal the deal, none of them could have foreseen the storm they had unleashed. The wheel of fate had begun to turn. The air was electric with tension as the evening of November 12, 2022, approached. The four friends had agreed on the date with a mix of eagerness and trepidation. In the days leading up to the experiment, the Harringtons and Valencias moved through their routines like actors rehearsing for a play, masking their true feelings with forced smiles and surface-level conversations. At the Harrington household, Ethan's nerves were evident. He had spent the entire afternoon obsessively cleaning their already immaculate home. Each flick of the duster and every wiped surface reflected his attempts to regain control over the situation spiraling beyond his comfort zone. Emily, on the other hand, was a picture of calculated determination. She had tried on 5 different outfits, finally settling on a sleek black dress that hugged her figure in all the right ways. She needed to exude confidence, even if her insides churned with a mix of excitement and guilt. Across the street at the Valencia's home, preparations carried a different tone. Carlos, ever the showman, had set the stage with soft music, dim lighting, and a bottle of his best añejo tequila, saved for special occasions. He moved through the house with a palpable energy, masking the gnawing uncertainty beneath his charismatic veneer. Sophia, by contrast, radiated a composed calm as she moved through her yoga routine, centering herself with practiced breaths. Yet, the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her unease. By 8 p.m., the streets of Willow Creek were cloaked in darkness, the occasional porch light flickering as the night settled in. Emily and Sophia exchanged quick glances across the street before embarking on their respective journeys into the unknown. For Emily, the short walk to the Valencia's house felt interminable. Each step was accompanied by the rapid beat of her heart, a mix of exhilaration and apprehension flooding her veins. At the Valencia's front door, Carlos greeted her with his signature smile, offering her a glass of tequila before she even stepped inside. "Welcome to Casa Valencia," he said, his tone warm yet tinged with an edge of mischief. Meanwhile, Sophia arrived at the Harringtons' home with an air of effortless grace. Her crimson dress flowed with each step, and the scent of jasmine trailed behind her, filling the room as she entered. Ethan, typically composed, fumbled with the wine opener in a rare display of nervousness. "Sophia," he said, his voice catching. "Welcome." The initial moments were predictably awkward. At the Valencias, Emily and Carlos engaged in polite small talk, their laughter forced and strained. Carlos, sensing her hesitation, took the lead, recounting humorous stories from his childhood in Mexico City. His tales were vivid, each one infused with the vibrant energy that had once drawn Sophia to him. Emily, despite herself, found the tension in her shoulders easing. She wasn't just listening to Carlos's words, she was drawn to the passion behind them, a stark contrast to Ethan's often reserved demeanor. Back at the Harringtons' house, Sophia's strategy was different. She insisted on teaching Ethan how to properly prepare guacamole, a simple act that became an unexpected dance of intimacy. Their hands brushed as they chopped avocados and squeezed limes, the closeness creating an undeniable charge between them. Ethan, unaccustomed to such candid attention, found himself drawn to Sophia in a way he hadn't anticipated. As the evening progressed, the walls of formality began to crumble. At the Valencias, Carlos's charm broke through Emily's defenses, his hand resting lightly on her arm as he leaned closer. The spark of connection between them was undeniable. Across the street, Sophia and Ethan moved from the kitchen to the living room, their conversation shifting from casual to deeply personal. Sophia's laughter, the way her eyes sparkled under the dim light, captivated Ethan in a way that left him both thrilled and unnerved. By the time midnight approached, the boundaries the couples had set earlier began to blur. At the Valencias, Carlos gently took Emily's hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "You're more than I expected," he murmured, his voice low. Emily, caught off guard by the intensity of the moment, found herself leaning into him, her breath hitching as the space between them disappeared. At the Harringtons, Sophia and Ethan sat closer than before, their knees brushing against each other. Ethan, emboldened by a mix of wine and Sophia's magnetic presence, reached out, his hand lightly resting on hers. Sophia didn't pull away. Instead, she met his gaze with a look that spoke volumes, an unspoken invitation. What began as tentative touches escalated quickly. Clothes were shed, breaths quickened, and the boundaries they had so carefully discussed evaporated in the heat of the moment. Each pair, in their respective homes, crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. In the aftermath, the weight of their actions settled heavily on each of them. At the Valencias, Emily lay awake beside Carlos, her mind a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, excitement, confusion, and a strange sense of loss. Across the street, Ethan stared at the ceiling, Sophia's presence beside him both a comfort and a torment. None of them could sleep, and none of them could fully comprehend what they had unleashed. The agreement had been to explore without attachment, to test boundaries without consequences. But as the early hours of the morning crept in, it was clear that this night would ripple far beyond its intended purpose. A storm was brewing, one that would tear through their lives with an intensity none of them could have foreseen. The morning after the fateful night, the streets of Willow Creek appeared unchanged, but for the Harringtons and Valencias, nothing would ever be the same. Beneath the veneer of polite smiles and neighborly waves, emotions churned, unspoken and unresolved. What had started as a shared experiment in rekindling passion now threatened to unravel the very fabric of their lives. At the Harrington household, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his untouched cup of coffee. The warmth of Sophia's presence from the night before lingered like a phantom, impossible to shake. Every detail of their time together replayed in his mind, the softness of her laugh, the way her dark eyes seemed to see through him, the fleeting touches that had ignited something he couldn't describe. Ethan felt an unfamiliar ache deep in his chest, something more than attraction, something dangerously close to longing. Emily, meanwhile, moved through the house with the efficiency of someone avoiding her thoughts. She washed dishes with unnecessary vigor, the clinking of plates and running water masking the turmoil inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about Carlos, the way he had made her feel seen, desired, and alive in a way Ethan hadn't in years. But beneath that newfound sense of vitality was a growing guilt. She had crossed a line, one that she wasn't sure could ever be erased. Across the street, the Valencias were no less shaken. Carlos sat in his office, staring at the stack of invoices on his desk without processing a single one. His usual confidence felt hollow, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. He had enjoyed his time with Emily, perhaps too much. But now, as he thought about Sophia with Ethan, a deep, irrational anger began to bubble within him. She was his, and the thought of her sharing any part of herself with another man ignited a fury he struggled to contain. Sophia, on the other hand, floated through the morning with a surprising sense of calm. Her time with Ethan had been everything she had hoped for, liberating, validating, and above all, different. For the first time in years, she had felt truly connected to someone. But as the hours wore on, the calm began to crack, giving way to a creeping unease. What had started as a harmless experiment now felt like the opening act of something far more dangerous. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to emerge. Ethan, who had once been a model of discipline, became distracted and absent-minded. At work, his colleagues noticed his focus slipping. His usual efficiency in coding was replaced by long stretches of staring blankly at his screen. On his lunch breaks, he began taking walks through the park near the Valencia's home, timing them to coincide with Sophia's yoga classes. At home, Ethan's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Late at night, when Emily had gone to bed, he found himself scrolling through old photos on his phone, lingering on images where Sophia's smile seemed to shine brightest. He downloaded a Spanish-language app, telling Emily it was for a project at work, but in truth, the rhythms of the language reminded him of Sophia. The logical part of him knew he was teetering on the edge of something destructive, but the pull was irresistible. Emily noticed the shift in her husband almost immediately. Though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what was wrong, she sensed the growing distance between them. She began to second-guess her actions, wondering if she had miscalculated the impact of their agreement. Her guilt compounded when she found herself thinking of Carlos more often than she cared to admit. She remembered the way he had touched her hand during their time together, the look in his eyes that made her feel cherished. These thoughts left her feeling conflicted, caught between her loyalty to Ethan and the spark she had found in Carlos. At the Valencia's house, Carlos's demeanor took a darker turn. His usual charm was overshadowed by a simmering tension that spilled into his work. His staff at Casa Valencia whispered about his uncharacteristic outbursts in the kitchen, his temper flaring over minor mistakes. At home, he began monitoring Sophia more closely, questioning her about her daily activities and subtly discouraging her from spending time with the Harringtons. Though he never said it outright, Sophia could feel his mistrust growing like a shadow over their marriage. Sophia, meanwhile, felt trapped between two worlds. Her growing affection for Ethan clashed with her commitment to Carlos. She found herself making excuses to linger in Ethan's presence, savoring the stolen moments when their paths crossed. But she also knew the danger of what they were doing, the thin line they were walking. Each interaction felt like a thread pulled tighter, threatening to unravel the delicate balance they were trying to maintain. The next neighborhood gathering marked a turning point. The Harringtons and Valencias found themselves together for the first time since the swap. The atmosphere was stifling, the air heavy with unspoken tensions. Emily noticed the way Ethan's gaze lingered on Sophia, how he seemed almost magnetically drawn to her. Across the table, Carlos clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. Sophia tried to act natural, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. After dinner, as the couples exchanged polite goodbyes, Emily pulled Ethan aside. "What's going on with you?" she demanded, her voice low but urgent. Ethan hesitated, avoiding her gaze. "Nothing," he replied too quickly, his tone defensive. But Emily knew better. She had seen the way he looked at Sophia, and her suspicions solidified into a painful certainty. Back at the Valencia's house, a similar confrontation unfolded. Carlos cornered Sophia in the kitchen, his voice barely controlled. "What's going on between you and Ethan?" he asked, his eyes dark with accusation. Sophia hesitated, caught off guard by his intensity. "Nothing," she said, her voice calm but guarded. But Carlos wasn't convinced, and his growing jealousy began to morph into something more dangerous. The experiment that had been intended to rekindle passion was spiraling out of control. The fragile bonds of trust that had once held their marriages together were fraying, and the emotions they had tried to suppress were bubbling to the surface. The seeds of obsession had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before they bore devastating fruit. By December 10, 2022, the neighborhood of Willow Creek was bathed in the festive glow of holiday lights. Cheerful wreaths adorned front doors, and snow-dusted rooftops glistened under the soft illumination of streetlights. The annual winter block party at Willow Community Hall was the highlight of the season, a gathering meant to bring neighbors together in celebration. But for the Harringtons and Valencias, it would become the stage for a reckoning. Inside the hall, the air was thick with the scent of mulled cider and pine. Laughter and holiday music filled the space, but beneath the surface of merriment, an undercurrent of tension pulsed between the two couples. Emily and Ethan arrived together, their smiles fixed and perfunctory. Across the room, Carlos and Sophia stood side by side, their body language rigid, betraying the cracks in their united front. As the evening wore on, the four found themselves inevitably drawn together. It began innocuously enough, polite greetings, shared compliments on the festive decor, and surface-level chatter. But as the minutes ticked by, the invisible barrier separating their shared history from their present turmoil began to erode. Emily's sharp eye caught the way Ethan's gaze drifted toward Sophia. Subtle but persistent, his eyes followed her every movement as if magnetically drawn. Emily's grip on her wine glass tightened, the stem pressing against her fingers with enough force to make her knuckles whiten. Across the circle, Carlos wasn't oblivious either. His jaw clenched as Sophia laughed at something Ethan said, the sound soft yet piercing in its familiarity. "So, how's work been, Carlos?" Ethan asked, his voice steady but devoid of its usual warmth. He was trying to maintain normalcy, but the edge in his tone betrayed him. Carlos's eyes narrowed slightly, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. "Busy as always," Carlos replied, his voice casual but strained. "And you? Still coding away at your desk?" The subtle jab didn't go unnoticed. Emily interjected, her voice overly bright. "Carlos's restaurant has been doing so well. Sophia must be so proud of him." Sophia gave a tight smile, but her eyes darted toward Ethan, who avoided her gaze. "Yes, he's worked very hard," she replied, her tone polite but distant. It was during the dessert portion of the evening that the thin veneer of civility finally shattered. Emily, emboldened by her suspicions and the wine, turned to Sophia, her smile razor-sharp. "You've been spending quite a bit of time at the park these days, haven't you?" she said lightly, her tone masking the accusation underneath. Sophia stiffened, her fork hovering mid-air. "I enjoy the fresh air," she replied evenly. "And I'm sure Ethan does too," Emily continued, her words cutting deeper now. "He's been walking more often, hasn't he?" Ethan froze, his face flushing. "Emily, let's not do this here," he muttered, his voice low and tense. Carlos, sensing the shift, turned to Ethan. "Why not? Maybe we should have this conversation. It seems overdue." His voice was calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. Emily's eyes flashed. "Then let's talk about it. Is there something you want to tell me, Ethan?" Her voice cracked slightly, a mix of pain and anger seeping through. The hall grew quieter as nearby neighbors began to notice the escalating tension. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her calm facade beginning to crack. "This isn't the time or place," she said softly, but Carlos wasn't listening. "What's going on between you two?" Carlos demanded, his gaze boring into Ethan. The jovial host from earlier was gone, replaced by a man teetering on the edge of control. Ethan opened his mouth to respond but faltered. The hesitation was all Emily needed. She turned to Carlos, her voice shaking with emotion. "Maybe you should ask your wife." Carlos's head snapped toward Sophia, his face a mask of fury. "What is she talking about?" The room had gone silent now, the once festive atmosphere replaced by a suffocating tension. Sophia, caught between her growing feelings for Ethan and her loyalty to Carlos, looked at no one. Her silence spoke volumes. Carlos slammed his hand on the table, the sound reverberating through the hall. "Answer me," he barked, his voice sharp and demanding. Sophia flinched but held her ground. "It's not what you think," Sophia said finally, her voice trembling. But her words only stoked the fire. "Not what I think?" Carlos's laugh was bitter. "You think I haven't noticed the looks, the whispers, the lies? How long has this been going on?" Emily's voice cut through the rising storm. "Long enough," she said, her eyes fixed on Ethan. Her voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. "And you didn't even have the decency to hide it." Ethan's defenses crumbled under the weight of her words. "Emily, please," he began, but she shook her head, cutting him off. "Don't," she said, her voice breaking. "Just don't." The confrontation reached its boiling point when Carlos turned back to Ethan, his fury barely contained. "You betrayed my trust," he said, his voice low but charged with anger. "You come into my home, his fists clenched at his sides, his body trembling. "Carlos." Sophia stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm, but he shook her off. The tension was unbearable, and the weight of their shared guilt and anger pressed down on everyone in the room. Finally, a neighbor intervened, ushering the couples apart with nervous smiles and polite excuses. But the damage had already been done. The thin threads holding their relationships together had snapped. As the Harringtons walked home in strained silence, Emily wiped at her tears, her mind racing with questions she wasn't ready to ask. Across the street, the Valencias entered their home, Carlos storming into his office while Sophia stood in the foyer, her hands shaking. Each couple retreated to their corners, but the echoes of the confrontation lingered, heavy and oppressive. The storm brewing between them had broken open for all to see. But the full force of its destruction was yet to come. The evening of January 15, 2023, descended on Willow Creek with an eerie calm. A thick fog blanketed the neighborhood, muffling sounds and casting an ominous pall over the suburban streets. Inside the Harrington household, the tension had reached a breaking point. Ethan sat in his office, ostensibly working late, but in reality, he was consumed by thoughts of Sophia. Across the hall, Emily moved through their home like a ghost, her movements mechanical, her mind replaying the events of the past weeks. The wounds from the block party confrontation had not healed, they had only festered. At the Valencia home, a similar storm brewed. Carlos had spent the day in a brooding silence, his mind a cauldron of anger and suspicion. Sophia, sensing his mood, had tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but the cracks in their marriage were impossible to ignore. That evening, Carlos finally voiced the question that had been gnawing at him for weeks. "What happened between you and Ethan?" he demanded, his voice low but sharp. Sophia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Nothing you don't already know," she said, her tone measured. But her refusal to meet his gaze was enough to confirm his worst fears. Carlos's temper flared, and for the first time, Sophia felt genuinely afraid of him. It was shortly after 8 p.m. when Emily called Ethan from his office. Her voice was tight, barely concealing the anger simmering beneath the surface. "We need to talk," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, he replied, rising from his desk. He didn't notice the way Emily's hands shook as she set the dining room table, nor did he see the determined glint in her eyes. Minutes later, the sound of the front door opening and closing startled them both. Emily turned to see Carlos and Sophia standing in the doorway. Carlos's face was a mask of barely contained fury, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sophia's eyes were red-rimmed, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his voice tinged with both surprise and apprehension. Emily crossed her arms over her chest, her posture rigid. "I invited them," she said flatly. "It's time we all faced the truth." The four of them gathered in the living room, the air thick with tension. Emily was the first to speak, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "This has gone on long enough," she began, her eyes darting between Ethan and Sophia. "We need answers. No more lies." Carlos's anger boiled over. "You want answers?" he spat, his gaze locked on Ethan. "Fine. Let's start with you. How long have you been trying to steal my wife?" Ethan stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I haven't been trying to steal anyone," he said evenly, though the flush creeping up his neck betrayed him. Carlos barked a bitter laugh. "Don't insult my intelligence. I see the way you look at her. The way she looks at you." Sophia tried to interject, her voice pleading. "Carlos, please." "No!" Carlos shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "I trusted you, Sophia. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Emily's composure cracked, tears streaming down her face as she turned to Ethan. "And what about us? Do you even care about our marriage anymore?" Ethan hesitated, his silence cutting deeper than any words could have. Emily let out a choked sob, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. As the accusations flew, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. Carlos took a step toward Ethan, his fists clenched, his body trembling with rage. "You ruined everything," he growled. "My marriage, my life, you took it all." Ethan raised his hands in a placating gesture, his voice steady but strained. "Carlos, listen to me. This isn't what you think." But Carlos wasn't listening. In a flash, he lunged at Ethan, the two men colliding with a force that sent them crashing into the coffee table. Sophia and Emily screamed, their voices rising above the chaos. The struggle was brief but violent, the sound of fists and shouts filling the room. Sophia tried to intervene, grabbing Carlos's arm in a desperate attempt to pull him away. "Stop it," she cried, her voice breaking. But Carlos, in his blind fury, shoved her aside. Emily stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall, her hands covering her mouth as she watched the scene unfold. "Carlos, please," she pleaded, her voice barely audible over the commotion. In the chaos, no one noticed Carlos grabbing the heavy crystal vase from the side table. It wasn't until the sickening thud of glass meeting flesh reverberated through the room that the fight came to an abrupt halt. Ethan crumpled to the floor, blood pooling around his head, his eyes wide with shock before closing forever. The room fell silent, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in like a stone. Carlos stood motionless, the shattered remains of the vase slipping from his hands. His face was a mask of horror as he stared at Ethan's lifeless body. Sophia sank to her knees, her hands trembling as she reached for her phone. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What have you done?" Emily rushed to Ethan's side, her nurse's training kicking in as she frantically searched for a pulse. "Call 911, she shouted, her voice shaking with panic. But deep down, she already knew it was too late. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, their wails piercing the heavy silence. Moments later, paramedics and police officers flooded the scene, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow over the quiet suburban street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion, their whispers filling the night air. As Carlos was handcuffed and led to a waiting police car, he didn't resist. His face was blank, his eyes hollow as he muttered, "It was an accident. I didn't mean to." Emily stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands stained with Ethan's blood. Sophia clung to the doorframe, her body racked with sobs. And in that moment, the idyllic image of Willow Creek was shattered, replaced by the stark reality of betrayal, jealousy, and a tragedy that would haunt them all. The morning after Ethan's death dawned gray and somber, the thick fog over Willow Creek refusing to lift, as though the town itself mourned the tragedy. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the cold wind outside the Harrington home, a stark contrast to the cheerful holiday lights still adorning nearby houses. The once idyllic neighborhood was now a hub of activity as detectives and forensic teams combed through the scene. Inside the Seattle Police Department's Homicide Division, Detective Olivia Carter took charge of the case. A seasoned investigator with a reputation for uncovering the truth, Carter was determined to get to the bottom of what had transpired in the Harrington living room. From the start, it was clear that this wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a complex web of motives, secrets, and lies. The three survivors, Emily, Carlos, and Sophia, were brought in for questioning. Separated into different interview rooms, each faced the weight of their actions and the scrutiny of Detective Carter. Emily's statement. Emily Harrington sat across from Carter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her tear-streaked face betrayed exhaustion and grief, but her eyes burned with a quiet fury. Her account of the events was disjointed, punctuated by long silences as she struggled to piece together what had happened. "I knew something was wrong for weeks," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Ethan was distant, distracted. I thought if we talked, we could fix things. But then Carlos," she broke off, her voice cracking. "I didn't think it would escalate like this." Carter pressed gently. "Did you notice any changes in Ethan's behavior before the incident? Anything unusual?" Emily hesitated before nodding. "He started walking more, listening to Latin music, learning Spanish. At first, I thought he was trying something new, but I knew it was about her. About Sophia." In another room, Sophia sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her usually poised demeanor was gone, replaced by a mixture of defiance and despair. She refused to speak without her lawyer present, but when she finally did, her confession was unexpected. "Yes," Sophia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was something between Ethan and me. But it wasn't physical, not since the night we agreed to the swap." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. "It was emotional. He understood me in a way Carlos never could." Her lawyer interjected, reminding her not to incriminate herself further, but Sophia pressed on. "Carlos was always so controlling. I just wanted a way out. Ethan gave me that, or at least I thought he could." Carter leaned forward, her sharp gaze unwavering. "And did you provoke Carlos? Did you say or do anything that could have triggered his actions that night?" Sophia flinched but didn't answer. Her silence spoke volumes. Carlos Valencia sat in the third room, his hands trembling as he recounted the events. Unlike Emily and Sophia, his emotions oscillated between anger and remorse. Initially advised by his lawyer to remain silent, the weight of what he had done proved too much. "I didn't mean to kill him," Carlos said, his voice raw with emotion. "I was angry, yes. He betrayed me. They both did. But I never meant for it to go this far." Carter studied him carefully. "Why did you bring the vase into the fight, Carlos? That doesn't sound accidental." Carlos's face crumpled, his bravado breaking. "I wasn't thinking. It all happened so fast. One moment, we were arguing, and the next, he was on the ground. I didn't even realize what I'd done until it was too late." As the statements were taken, forensic teams uncovered critical evidence that painted a fuller picture of the tragedy. A series of text messages between Ethan and Sophia revealed the depth of their emotional entanglement. Their exchanges were intimate, filled with confessions and dreams of a life that never had the chance to materialize. One particularly damning message from Ethan read, "I can't keep pretending. You're the only one I think about." Emails found on Ethan's computer revealed an unsent draft to Emily, in which he confessed his feelings for Sophia and his plans to leave. Detective Carter noted the timestamps. Ethan had written the draft just hours before the confrontation. The murder weapon, the crystal vase, was sent to the lab for analysis. Carlos's fingerprints were found on the shards, along with traces of Ethan's blood and hair. The force required to cause the fatal injury was consistent with the descriptions of Carlos's outburst. Carter also interviewed neighbors, who painted a troubling picture of the relationships between the two couples. "They were close, too close," one neighbor remarked. "We all noticed the tension at the block party. It was like watching a pot about to boil over." Another neighbor, who had been walking her dog on the night of the murder, mentioned hearing raised voices and a crash. "It wasn't the kind of argument you can ignore," she said. "It sounded like someone had completely lost control." As Carter pieced together the evidence, it became clear that the swap was never just about rekindling passion. It had ignited long-buried insecurities, unspoken resentments, and forbidden desires. Emily's suggestion of the swap now seemed less like a spontaneous idea and more like a calculated attempt to test Ethan's fidelity. Sophia's actions, while partly born of desperation, revealed a manipulative streak that blurred the lines between victim and instigator. And Carlos's insecurities and temper made him a powder keg waiting to explode. Each person bore some responsibility for the tragedy. Each decision, each hidden feeling, had led them inexorably to that fateful night. By the end of the first week of the investigation, Carter stood before a board filled with photos, timelines, and notes. The narrative of what had happened was clear, but the deeper truth, the emotional and psychological currents that had driven these events, remained elusive. "This isn't just about one act of violence," Carter murmured to her partner. "It's about everything that led up to it. And I'm not sure we'll ever truly untangle it all." As the investigation moved toward the trial, the fallout from Ethan's death continued to ripple through the lives of everyone involved, casting long shadows over what had once seemed like a perfect suburban life. 6 months after Ethan's tragic death, the trial of Carlos Valencia began on a gray and rainy Monday morning in June 2023. The courthouse buzzed with quiet whispers as reporters and spectators filled the gallery, eager to witness the culmination of a case that had captivated the community. The lives of the Harringtons and Valencias, once intertwined by friendship, were now irrevocably shattered. Carlos entered the courtroom flanked by his defense team, his once vibrant presence now diminished to a pale, gaunt shadow of himself. His eyes betrayed the weight of sleepless nights and unrelenting guilt. Across the room, Emily Harrington sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face a mask of grief and quiet resolve. Sophia slipped in through a side entrance, her vibrant energy dimmed by months of scrutiny and shame. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words, as though the very room held its breath for what was to come. The district attorney wasted no time painting Carlos as a man consumed by jealousy, driven to violence by his insecurities and suspicions. This was not a moment of blind rage, the prosecutor argued. Carlos Valencia made a choice. He picked up that vase, and he struck Ethan Harrington with enough force to end his life. This was an act of deliberate violence, fueled by jealousy and possessiveness. Key pieces of evidence were presented to the jury: the shattered crystal vase, the text messages between Ethan and Sophia, and the forensic analysis of the fatal blow. Witnesses were called, including neighbors who recounted the tension between the two couples in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Emily Harrington took the stand, her voice steady but laced with pain as she described the final moments of her husband's life. "Ethan didn't deserve this," she said, her voice cracking as tears welled in her eyes. He wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve to die like that. Carlos's defense team portrayed him as a man pushed to the brink by betrayal and emotional manipulation. Carlos Valencia is not a killer, his lawyer argued. He is a husband and a father who was provoked into a tragic, impulsive act. He never intended to kill Ethan Harrington. Sophia was called as a witness for both the prosecution and the defense, her testimony a key turning point in the trial. Under cross-examination, she admitted to her emotional involvement with Ethan, her voice trembling as she recounted their connection. "I didn't want it to happen this way," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I never wanted anyone to get hurt." Carlos's own testimony was a mixture of remorse and desperation. "I lost control," he confessed. "I didn't think, I just reacted. If I could take it back, I would. I didn't mean to kill him." After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of manslaughter. Taking into account Carlos's lack of prior offenses and the circumstances surrounding the crime, the judge sentenced him to 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The decision sparked mixed reactions, with some believing the sentence was too lenient, while others felt it was a fair balance of justice and mercy. In the months following the trial, the ripples of Ethan's death continued to spread. Emily sold the Harrington home and moved out of Willow Creek, unable to bear the memories that haunted its walls. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in helping others, but the weight of her choices and the loss of Ethan lingered. Sophia left Carlos and relocated to another city, seeking a fresh start far from the shadows of her past. Despite her attempts to rebuild her life, the guilt of her role in the tragedy clung to her like a second skin. Carlos began his sentence at a state penitentiary, his days filled with reflection and regret. He wrote letters to Sophia, most of which went unanswered, and tried to find redemption in the routine of prison life. But no amount of time could erase the moment that had changed everything. The once idyllic streets of Willow Creek carried on, but for those left behind, the scars remained. The experiment that began as a daring attempt to rekindle passion had spiraled into betrayal, obsession, and ultimately, tragedy. The lives of 4 people had been forever altered, a stark reminder of the dangers of crossing boundaries meant to remain intact. Do you think Carlos's sentence was fair? Should he have received more time, or less? Who do you believe bears the most responsibility for what happened, Emily, Ethan, Sophia, or Carlos? Why? Could this tragedy have been avoided, or was it inevitable given the choices they made? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping true crime stories that explore the dark complexities of human relationships.